Hello and welcome to this very special event on behalf of ORF. Let me welcome to this special session on the 2020 Lowy Institute poll release and a discussion on some of its most salient aspects as they pertain to Australia, as they pertain to India, and the larger sort of global order that we are witnessing at the moment. The poll, which is in its 16th year, comes at a particularly critical moment in global politics, in geostrategy, and regional geoeconomic shifts. As such, it offers some remarkable insights into the mood of the Australian public, into how they view the regional and global order, how they view some of the world, what sense do they have about some of the larger economic and multilateral realities around them. And it was very engaging in some ways because it tells you how sensitive for democracies, how important it is for policymakers to be alive and sensitive to some of the ground realities that they face. So here we are today to discuss this poll, to virtually release it for our Indian audience, and to discuss what it tells us about the mood in Australia and some of its implications for Australia-India relations as well. We have an excellent panel with us today. We have Professor Stephen Smith, a former Minister for Defence and Foreign Affairs of Australia and presently a board member of Perth USAsia Centre. We have two members from Lowy Institute. We have Alex Oliver, Director of Research, Lowy Institute, and Natasha Kassam, who is a research fellow at the Lowy and, of course, director of this very, very important and interesting poll that Lowy has releases annually now. And I think I would be remiss not to point out that, we are discussing this poll at a time when Australia-India relations have also taken a very dramatic shift. There is a lot of momentum in the relationship. The recent virtual summit between the Indian Prime Minister and his Australian counterpart has led to some very intense speculations about the possible engagement and going forward. So I think we are looking at this poll from Indian perspective with a great degree of interest as to what it tells us about Australia's view of India and Australia's view of the larger geopolitical and geoeconomic shift in the world. I will also like to announce for those who are joining us today that we will have, after the opening remarks from our presenters, we will have some time for discussion. So please send us your questions, comments, observations via chat box. We will try to take them up as many of them as possible in the limited time that we have. But please do send us your views, questions, comments, whatever you deem fit. So let me begin by inviting Professor Stephen Smith for his initial remarks and a formal virtual release, of course, of this poll for our Indian audience. Professor Smith, here you go.
Well, Harsh, thank you very much. And thanks to our panelists, Alex and Natasha, for joining us to go through the detail of the Lowy poll. Firstly, in my capacity as a member of the board of the Perth USAsia Centre, can I just say how pleased I am to be associated with not just the Lowy poll, but the ORF launch of the Lowy poll virtually into India. Natasha and I were chatting before we came on air that our last overseas visit in the pre-COVID area was to the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi in early January, and I haven't set foot out of Australia since. But the Perth USAsia Centre focuses on the Indo-Pacific, and as a consequence, we focus on India and Indonesia in particular. But you can't have an Indo-Pacific without India. So attending Raisina Dialogue is very important to us. Doing joint events with the ORF and with Lowy is also important to us. And last year in Australia, we launched the Lowy 2019 poll in Perth in Western Australia. This year's launch of the poll is deeply significant. It's the 16th year of the Lowy poll, so a good contribution to Australian foreign policy and public attitude to Australian foreign policy over more than a decade and a half, but also potentially unique, a poll about COVID and Australians' reaction to the handling of COVID, not just by the Australian government, but by other countries. I simply want to set the scene. I'm not going to try and steal any of Natasha's and Alex's thunder. The poll is very well worth reading. From a foreign policy perspective, but also from a political perspective, a poll is simply a snapshot of when it's taken. And in terms of this year's local poll, over 2,500 Australians polled in the middle to the end of March. And on the COVID poll, about 3,000 Australians polled about COVID in particular from the middle to the end of April. Now, if we thought that the whole world had changed since Ricina in January, then the whole world has also changed even further from the end of March and the end of April until July. But I think in terms of the snapshot that we see in the Lowy Institute's work, the events that have occurred since the end of March and the end of April in the case of COVID will only reinforce those trend lines that we've seen. Now, often it's said that the worst foreign policy decisions are made in response to a domestic political event. Governments will often pride themselves that they make decisions not on the basis of a partisan political domestic view, but advancing the national interests of their nation, whether it's the security interest or economic interest. But governments, whether they're liberal democracies or other forms of government, are always keenly interested in what their public are thinking, in what their constituents are thinking, in what their communities are thinking. And so the Lowy poll gives us a very adroit snapshot of Australian attitudes in the first quarter of this year, so far as general foreign policy matters are concerned, but also a snapshot of COVID. As we would expect, through Australian eyes at that period of time, most focus is on our relationship with the United States, the view of the Trump administration and the view of President Trump, and our relationship with China. What the poll makes clear, Australians now regard as a substantially changed China under Xi Jinping. And so the quick snapshot and takeaway from the poll is an ongoing view by Australians that our security alliance with the United States remains an essential part of our international order. Secondly, it's clear that the view of China has changed dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years, coinciding with a much more assertive and aggressive China. And as a consequence, through this poll, Australians now see China not so much through the eyes of a prosperous economy, but through the eyes of a much more assertive, aggressive China and the potential security fears and concerns that that brings. On COVID, it regards the Australian government as generally handling the COVID crisis very well, and indeed better than most other jurisdictions. But an important point that's made in the context of that poll is that individual citizens looking to their own nations to respond to COVID rather than multilateral organisations like the UN or international organisations. Since the poll was done, we've seen, in my view, a substantial firming up of the Australia-India relationship. Now, taking the India-Australia relationship to a higher level has been an ambition of many Australians, including my own ambitions, for a long period of time. And finally, we're making a great deal of progress. Not just the virtual summit between our two Prime Ministers, Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Modi, but also very much hard work done beforehand, including on the economic front with the Peter Varghese economic report on India and Ambassador Anil Wadhwa's pending economic study on Australia. And we must use these two vehicles to enhance our economic, our trade and investment relationship. We're doing very well on the strategic and security front, in my view, but we need to do much more on the economic engagement front. And so, Harsh, with those scene setters and a bit of licensed commentary on the Australia-India relationship, I'm very pleased to officially announce the Lowy Institute poll on Australian attitudes to foreign policy, virtually launched in India for 2020. And like our audience, look very much forward to the contributions from Natasha and Alex to dissect the work that Lowy has done.
Thank you, Professor Smith. That was, it was, you set the scene quite, in a manner that I think allows us to take this discussion forward with Natasha and Alex, going into more specifics about some of the trend lines that this poll showcases, and also some of the broader debates that perhaps it engenders, both in terms of Australia's larger role in the Indo-Pacific, as well as its interactions with bilateral partners. So, Natasha, I'll give the floor to you now to give us a sense of this poll, give a sense of the history of this exercise, and what do you think are some of the most salient aspects? I know you would particularly want to touch upon the China angle here, given your work on China, and anything else that is important for our viewers, for our participants today, from an Indian perspective to understand, before I go to Alex to sort of round it off with some of the other trend lines that emerge. So, Natasha, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Harsh, and thank you to Professor Smith for launching the poll this year. I'd also just like to thank the Observer Research Foundation for hosting us. It is such a pleasure to be able to do this digitally, even if we can't do it in person. Like Professor Smith, my last trip outside of Sydney, let alone Australia, was to Delhi to attend the Raisina Dialogue. And so I'm really glad that we're able to continue this conversation, albeit remotely. So as has already been mentioned, the poll has been around for 16 years now, a project that I inherited from Alex Oliver last year. And really, it was intended to take the temperature on Australian views of the world around them. In Australia, like in many countries, foreign policy has been very much the remit of elite, something discussed by politicians, academics, practitioners, but rarely has it forayed into the public view. And to my mind, this is a great shame, and it is something that should be debated by publics. Publics should be asking questions of their government and asking questions about our place in the world. It's interesting to me that remarkable events, particularly of this year, has started to shift that conversation a little bit more. It was only a year ago in Australia that we were holding a federal election, and almost no words were said about any of the foreign policy challenges. Elections here in Australia, like in many places, are fought on tax policy and local issues, occasionally immigration or climate change, but more often than not, they remain in the domestic sphere. Just over a year later, it's really impossible to imagine a similar story playing out in Australia. And this, in no large part, is because of the way in which China looms in the Australian view at every level. It's impossible now to imagine any political debate in Australia that doesn't have a China element to it. And as I say, this is a really significant shift in a very short period of time. So I thought I would pull out some of those key details about the way in which the Australia-China relationship has changed. I believe that many countries can learn from Australia's experience in responding to changes in China's behaviour, just as Australia can learn from India's experience. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then my colleague Alex will talk about some of the other findings from the poll, including on India and the quadrilateral dialogue, amongst other things. But the Australia-China story is one of great unravelling. It really is almost impossible to imagine now, but 6 years ago, Xi Jinping visited Australia and addressed our parliament. There was such an incredibly warm tone. Our Prime Minister described Xi Jinping as a great friend. The streets were lined with people waving Chinese flags. It's only 6 years ago that this could happen, and today the relationship could not be in a more different place. So, seemingly in response to Australia's call for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen that China has placed new restrictions on particular economic exports from Australia, and they've been warning international students and tourists against travelling to Australia. And again, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that all of this souring in the political relationship has had an effect and played out in the sphere of public opinion, which the annual Lowy Institute poll looks at. But I think it's important to keep in mind that Australia has really been an outlier in terms of public opinion towards China. if you look, for example, at the global attitude surveys that are conducted by Pew, there are many countries, including India, for example, but also the UK, the United States, Philippines, South Korea, that about a decade ago started to feel much more negatively towards China, and that trajectory has continued. That wasn't the case in Australia until 2 years ago. Australian views towards China remained largely buoyant. And so again, that shift is even more dramatic because now Australians have caught up with publics from around the world and in some cases even overtaken them in that negative view. There are a few explanations, but I think the most significant is that until 2 years ago, Australians saw China very much as an economic opportunity and that Australia's prosperity would be built upon all of the growth that had happened in China. What we've seen here at home in Australia is that the rise of debates about foreign interference, about Huawei and 5G networks, about economic coercion, and about Hong Kong have really seen this perception shift. And more Australians are seeing China as less of an economic opportunity and more of a security threat. And in fact, the economic opportunity that China does provide is now the source of some anxiety for many Australians. So in our poll, we found that 9 in 10 Australians want the government to look for other markets to reduce our economic dependence on China. We've never had such a high level of agreement about a single issue in our 16 years of polling. We've also seen Australians' trust in China falling to record lows and very low levels of confidence in Xi Jinping. So only a quarter of Australians said that they trusted China, which has halved, or more than halved in just 2 years. So it's today it's 23%, and in 2018 it was 52%. Similarly, only 1 in 5 Australians say that they have confidence in President Xi to do the right thing regarding world affairs. Again, that is halved in only 2 years. We don't normally see changes in public opinion happening this swiftly. The only leaders that Australians trust less than Xi Jinping is North Korea's Kim Jong-un. And the only country that ranks similarly in terms of trust for Australians is Russia. So it's really, it's quite damning when you look at it in that way. We also asked in our poll this year about some of the specific policy measures that are being debated in Australia. And I know that some of them are similar to the issues that are being debated in India. So one interesting question is whether Australia should have something akin to a Magnitsky Act, where we would put sanctions upon officials associated with human rights abuses. This is something that exists in the United States, although it hasn't been used against Chinese officials until a couple of days ago, essentially. And when we asked the question in Australia, 8 in 10 said that we should sanction Chinese officials that were associated with human rights abuses. We've also started to see some of those debates around having Chinese researchers collaborate with Australian universities in the same way you have them in the United States. And here, 6 in 10 say that Australia should restrict those joint research projects where they are in defence and security fields. And the other thing that I think is particularly interesting for our Indian colleagues is the way Australians are responding to Chinese technology. Last year, we asked Australians what we should prioritise when considering foreign technology companies wanting to provide infrastructure in Australia. And many Australians said at that point that we should prioritise protecting Australians from foreign state intrusion. We asked a similar question another way this year, where we asked whether Chinese companies should be allowed to provide technology for infrastructure. And the majority said that they shouldn't. Of course, Australia was one of the first countries in the world to exclude Huawei from our 5G network. And we can see that that decision has received quite a lot of support. India is, I think, the first country in the world to limit TikTok as an example. And that has sparked debate in many countries, including Australia. So we'll be watching that with particular interest. The last thing I just briefly wanted to say is that the China story in Australia has very much changed. There is increasing awareness of problematic behaviour from China. If you look at news coverage in China, news coverage of China in Australia, there are front page stories in the tabloids every single day about China. And so there's been a really significant shift here. And in some ways, I think we've seen similar shifts happen in countries like India. But I just would exercise a little bit of caution when we assume that this increasingly aggressive behaviour from China has had negative effects worldwide. Of course, many countries are unimpressed by this bullying, they're unimpressed by economic coercion. But I think it's important that 2020, as a very kind of strange year, I think what it's done is exacerbate existing views of China rather than really change people's minds. So here in Australia, where there were building negative views towards China, those have been consolidated. I think the same is true in India. But there are other countries such as Cambodia, Hungary, Pakistan, Russia that had quite positive views of China. And I think those have been exacerbated or consolidated, I should say, by China's ability to largely contain the coronavirus, even after a very problematic start. And so it's really interesting to me to see how different countries look at the same country, which is China, and its behaviour, but are learning different lessons and taking away different messages. That's all I wanted to say about the Australia-China relationship. I'm really looking forward to taking questions after Alex's presentation. Thanks again, Harsh.
Thank you, Natasha. That was excellent. And I think the point that you made about how like-minded countries, at least in the region, need to look at each other's behavior, shifting public attitudes, and perhaps can learn from each other. And it will be interesting to see how this learning happens over a period of time among members of this like-minded group of countries in the region. So I'll take it forward with Alex now. Alex, you have to be the last person now to round this off for us in terms of what is the big picture that emerges. In particular, I think the question that is fundamental to our understanding of Australian foreign policy, that for a long period of time, it has been trying to balance America and China. So what does this poll tell us? That now are we shifting in one direction? Is Australian public mood shifting in one direction and with little possibility of this balance being effectively tackled? Or somewhere down the line, you do see that possibility of Australia coming back to the middle of the road sort of foreign policy debates, which seem to have been, perhaps as Natasha put it, this has been an extraordinary year. So perhaps this extraordinary moment in global politics is also shaping some of this behavior. So over to you, Alex, with your comments on balancing China, America, and anything else that you want to take on in this juncture before we move on to other aspects of this. Alex, you'll have to unmute.
Sorry, and I'm going to apologise in advance for my internet connection, which is usually very good, but tonight of all nights seems to have gone on blink. So please excuse any awkward gaps. Thank you, Harsh. And I wanted to thank also Samir Saran for the kind invitation to us. Thank you to Stephen Smith for those very kind words about the poll, which I think started just a few years before the professor took on the foreign ministership of Australia. So he's seen it evolve over the 16 years of its life, and it certainly showed some very interesting shifts in Australian opinion. You're right, Harsh, it has been a very delicate balance for Australian foreign policy, and Natasha has talked about the China aspect of that balance, and that's obviously a crucial relationship for Australia as it is for the rest of the world. In another piece of recent Lowy Institute research, actually, we confirmed that China is now the largest trading partner of approximately 60 nations in the world. 2/3 of the world trades more with China than with the United States, and that position is actually a complete reversal of the situation just 2 decades ago. But of course, relationships with the United States and China are not just about trade. Investment relationships are important. US investment abroad is obviously hugely important. And for Australia, the US stock of direct investment in Australia is 12 times that of China's, which might surprise some Australians in particular. But the critical relationship, Harsh, as you pointed out, and as Stephen pointed out earlier, is that of Australia's security. Unlike India, of course, Australia and the United States have had a security alliance since 1951. And while it's not a guarantee that either party will come to the defence of the other, it does recognise that an armed attack against a party is dangerous to the other's safety, and that they will act to meet the common danger. There's been a lot of discussion of relationships with the United States under the Trump administration, as Professor Smith alluded to. And clearly, the current US president is not particularly popular around the globe. We've polled on various US presidential candidates over our 16 years of polling, and in 2016, 7% of Australians would have preferred Hillary Clinton as president, regardless of what they would have expected. And in 2020, 73% of Australians prefer Joe Biden as president, which was exactly the same number who selected President Obama over candidate McCain in 2008. Now, in 2016, just before the election in the United States, Australians were spooked by the idea of a Trump presidency and its impact on the alliance between the United States and Australia. More than half of our population said that Australia should in fact distance itself from the United States if elected President Trump. Nearly 60% said they would be less likely to support Australia taking military action in coalition with the United States under Donald Trump. And of course, Australia has been one of the United States' most reliable alliance coalition partners in military action, for example, in the Middle East. And support for the alliance that year, so that was the year leading up to the 2016 election, dropped 9 points, which was the single biggest drop on that measure in our poll's history. But just 1 year later, 65% of Australia said that Australia should remain close to the United States, regardless of who was president, and support for the alliance bounced back by 6 points. And this year it is at a very respectable 78%. Is either very or fairly important for Australia's security. So it's clear that Australians distinguish between the value of having the world's largest military power as a security ally, and the person sitting in the Oval Office. Those two are quite distinct in Australians' minds. And in this, Australians aren't alone. I did some research for a book chapter for USAsia, which was published last year, and I found that citizens of most other countries surveyed by Pew Research, which Natasha has mentioned, and other organisations had quite different responses to the United States as a nation and its president. And in general, favourability towards the United States as a nation has held very strongly, and without exception is higher now than it was in the mid-2000s during the Bush presidency. And attitudes to the US president, though, are far less favourable, but they're also improving. For example, there was a 27-point jump in Indian sentiment on the Pew polling towards Donald Trump late last year, and sentiment improved in almost all countries polled. But that said, Donald Trump has certainly caused some consternation here in Australia. Many of his signature policies are very unpopular. The imposition of tariffs on imports into the United States. Australia was caught up in those at the beginning, although it's managed to disentangle itself to this point. His criticism of the defence spending of allies, as you would have heard his criticism of NATO allies and their defence spending, his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 3/4 of Australians disapprove of that. His withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, which 80% of Australians disapprove of, which is a very high number. 70% of Australians have no confidence that he will do the right thing in world affairs, and in this he's only slightly lower than the proportion who say the same thing about China's President Xi Jinping. So as to whether alliances with the United States are still in good odour, attitudes are strong right across the Indo-Pacific. The public in South Korea is more strongly favourable to the US alliance than ever. Japanese attitudes are very firmly in favour and almost a mirror image of their people in the Philippines are among the US's strongest supporters. Indonesia is probably the weakest link in the region. And then to move to Harsh's questions of balance, this is something that obviously other countries in the region are grappling with, who also count China as their largest trading partner among the 6 nations of the world who do that. How do you reconcile a relationship between the United States and that with China at a time when the two superpowers are increasingly engaged in a very messy strategic competition? In Australia, we've talked about it as the China choice, which are the words used by one of our eminent professors based in Canberra, Hugh White. If Australia were forced to choose between the two relationships, which should it be? Is prosperity or security more important in the 21st century? Is China really a security threat in the region, or is it a peacefully rising power? No doubt India is itself coming to a reckoning on this question, particularly since the latest very violent plantations in the Himalayan border region. And Australians too are finding the balance shifting subtly. Since 2013, we've asked a question about which relationship is more important to Australians, a pretty simple question. In 2013, the answer was narrowly in the United States' favour by 48 to 37. In 2016, the result was a dead heat, so it looked like Australians were drawing slightly away from the United States and slightly towards China. But the events of the past few years, which Natasha has recounted, Chinese interference in Australian politics, other factors are its military build-up in the South China Sea, Australia's economic dependency on China, the human rights crisis in Xinjiang, freedoms in Hong Kong, and more recently, China's handling of the COVID crisis have tipped the balance much more in favour of the United States. This year, 55% of Australians said that the United States relationship was more important, compared with 40% choosing China. But those are not completely universal results across the demographic spectrum, and that's perhaps something we can talk about in Q&A later. For younger Australians aged under 30, the result is reversed, which is consistent with what we found in many aspects of attitudes of this age group to China and the United States. But for most of the population, the relationship with the United States is based on a sense of shared values and ideals, and that seems to be the driver of this positive sentiment towards it and towards the alliance. To a great extent, Australians see the United States as a bulwark against potential aggression from China. And interestingly, across all age groups, there's not much conviction the United States is in decline relative to China, contrary to the sort of common narrative about American decline. Slightly more say that the United States' power will weaken after the COVID crisis, slightly more than say the same thing about China's power. But last year, 50% of the country said that we should maintain strong relationships with the United States, even if this might harm our relationships with China as our largest trading partner. It's not just the ANZUS alliance that Australians are in favour of. We asked a new question this year, which was extraordinarily interesting, and the timing was perfect. We asked about attitudes to the Quad, although of course we didn't use that exact expression. But in one of the strongest results we've seen in our polling history, 88% of Australians support Australia participating in the Quad, contributing to peace and security in our region. This is quite timely. Harsh referred to, and Stephen Smith referred to, a strengthening of the Australia-India relationship to a point that it has not been to date. It appears that Australia will be invited to join in the Malabar exercises this year. That'll be the first time since our sole previous participation in 2007 in the Bay of Bengal. It seems, and our Indian experts will have more to say about this, that the Galwan incident might be a catalyst for Quad security cooperation to really solidify. The past 2 years have seen the Quad reincarnated after its first outing more than a decade ago. And if so, this is something that our polling indicates almost all Australians would welcome strongly. We published a very clever piece by a young writer called Arti Bettigary in the Lowy Institute's Interpreter magazine today, which described the Australia-India relationship as having been based on 3 Cs: cricket, curry, and the Commonwealth. And in light of the changing geopolitics of 2020, she suggested we add a couple more Cs to the list: China and containment thereof. So this leads to Australian attitudes to India and vice versa. Our attitudes to India and India's to Australia over the years have been, shall we say, sort of lukewarm to warmish. Over the 15 years of what we call our Lowy Institute thermometer, where we measure the warmth of Australians' feelings towards a range of different countries every year, the numbers towards India have ranged from a high of 62 degrees in 2006 to a low of 52 degrees this year. It's not a huge range. The numbers have been cooling somewhat in the past 3 years with respect to trust in India and with respect to confidence in its Prime Minister, but they're still relatively warm. In 2012, we also took a poll of Indian attitudes to Australia, and the warmth held by Indians towards Australians was almost identical at 50 to 56 degrees to the way that Australians felt towards India. So at least it's an even balance. Back in late 2012, 83% of Indians regarded China as a security threat. I imagine were we to poll that question now, the result will be even higher. The border claims were obviously a significant factor then, as they are now, as well as China's nuclear weapons, resource competition, Pakistan and China's relationships with other countries in the region. At the same time, the same number of Indians regarded relationships with the United States as strong, and most of them wanted them to be further strengthened. So that's just another few highlights from our 2020 polling, and also some public opinion from other organisations around the world on whom we rely to build a bigger picture of public attitudes towards global affairs generally. There are a wealth of other findings in our public opinion poll this year, and which also cast some interesting light on the trends that we've observed over the 16 years of our polling. As Professor Smith said, the poll is a snapshot, but where the real value of polling like this is, as in Pew polling and the Chicago Council polling, is in the trend data that gives over time. So snapshots will give you, a quick glimpse of what's happening this year, but the trend data over 15 years gives you a much stronger idea of where public opinion is headed. So we can talk about some of those issues that we've polled on over time: globalisation, free trade, multilateral cooperation, which is going to be a very hot topic in the next few years, and climate change, of course, which we can discuss in the Q&A if there's time. So thank you, Harsh.
Thank you, Alex. That was a very good overview of the poll and some of its most salient findings, I think, as they pertain to India. In particular, you dwelled on a part of the polling which I think many in India would be very, very interested in. In particular, I think the result on Quad is particularly interesting, given the general opinion that it has not lived up to expectations and it has not been doing enough to mobilize regional balance of power. But I think the results from Australia actually show a greater degree of support for the larger idea of Quad than perhaps it might look from the outside. So I'll come to all of you in a bit, but let me go to Professor Smith first. Professor Smith, as Alex was pointing out, the sort of the cliche of Commonwealth, curry, and cricket being the sort of trifecta of issues that have driven Australia-India relations and have kept Australia-India relations where they were sort of on an even keel, not really very exciting, but also not really as problematic as perhaps some of the other relations are. But do you see now the larger sort of geopolitical and economic trends as they are shaping up? Do you see Australia-India relations really being coming out of this stupor? We have seen a lot of investment being made by the leadership in the two countries. Successive Indian prime ministers, successive Australian prime ministers have invested, bureaucracies have invested. But do you see this percolating down to a level where you can generically expect a warming of relationship going beyond just the usual students coming in and playing of cricket, etc.? Do you see a broadening and deepening of this relationship going forward?
Absolutely, I do. But I think it's essential that we bring our economic relationship to the same level that we've been bringing our strategic defence security relationship and discussions. I've always thought that if we typecast our relationship as cricket, curry and Commonwealth, we're actually looking back, not looking forward. They're good things to have. We share a whole range of things: respect for the rule of law, respect for property rights, respect for democracy. India, the largest democracy in the world. But if we're really to pitch our relationship forward, I think we need to look at our modern characteristics. So firstly, an often unsung important part of the relationship, the modern relationship, is we've now got close to 1 million people of Indian origin in Australia. So 1 million out of 25 million is significant. That can actually have an impact on a Lowy Institute poll about what your attitude is to the Indian Prime Minister, because many people of Indian origin take a very intense interest in Indian domestic politics. But I think the key now has to be, yes, it's true that in the last decade and a half, governments, ministers, prime ministers have tried to do more with the relationship. I think two things have happened. Firstly, you've got that diaspora present in Australia. Secondly, the penny is now dropping, and the Lowy poll brings this out. Australia economically must diverse. Too many eggs have been in the China basket for too long a period of time, and in the blink of an eye, India will be the third great power and will be number 2 or number 3 economy in the world. So growth, trade, investment, and future potential direct foreign investment into Australia, which, as Alex said, is very important to our ongoing economic prosperity, India is the number one attraction in that respect. And the security shared values and a more aggressive, assertive China, including in the Indian Ocean, will only add to drive that together. But to me, the key is we have to develop our economic relationship. The Australian public in the Lowy poll have got the need for economic diversification much sooner and in much larger and stronger numbers than the Australian business community. When I was last in Washington, what was once the single biggest supporter and lobby group of trade and investment with China, the America-China Business Council, essentially had given up on China and Chinese economic activity. Their CEO said 80% of my members will now have nothing to do with China because of the way in which they've dealt with us, our intellectual property, our contracts. Australian business now needs to understand that the key to our prosperity is economic diversification. That doesn't mean stop what you're doing with China, but it does mean you've got to find different commodities, different services, different markets. And India is the number one attraction so far as I'm concerned. So using the Varghese economic study of India and Anil Wadhwa's economic study of Australia has to be the pathway for growing that economic relationship using the Indian diaspora, which is now deeply significant, to drive that to economic success.
Thank you. Yes, I think the economic dimension remains one which is slightly problematic if you're looking at the broader relationship. And though we have made great progress on the strategic front, that economic and trade is one area where we need to do much more. And perhaps, hopefully, the debates, the sort of debate on economic globalization and global supply chains, on how to restructure economies post-pandemic, perhaps will galvanize the two nations into action. And Natasha, if I can come to you, yeah, go ahead, sir. Please.
I was just going to say there's an emerging slogan in Australia, which is a self-reliant India with Australia's assistance.
Yes, I think the idea of self-reliance is also something that is that Indian policymakers are promoting, and it is sending out some mixed signals around the world. So I think it also needs to be clarified what it actually means in operational terms. Natasha, if I can come to you on the China question, you have laid out in your opening remarks a set of issues on which you have seen the souring of the relationship, on which public attitudes have turned. Can you prioritize them in the sense that if you were to prioritize as to which issues are particularly resonant with the Australian public, with the Australian mood, which have allowed them to now move dramatically away from China? Would it be economics as in terms of the larger reality, or because we also see an undercurrent of democracy debate here in Australia, that the reason why you want to do Quad is also because the values question is attached to it. So is the democracy is emerging an important variable in Australian thinking in terms of foreign outreach?
I think it absolutely is. We have conversations in the history of Australian foreign policy that wax and wane about the idea of a values-based foreign policy. I do think that this isn't necessarily something that has changed when it comes to the China relationship. And I'll give you an example. I talked a lot about all of the dramatic shifts that we've seen in changes in public opinion for Australians towards China. But some things have stayed consistent. And one of them is Australian concern about the human rights situation in China. So we've been asking the same questions about this for the last 15 years. And over that period, 3/4 of the country have said that Australia does not do enough to pressure China on human rights. The vast majority of Australians have said that China's human rights record makes them think more negatively about the country. So that is an issue that has been long-standing. I think Australia also has perhaps not as high a level of awareness of democracies in our region as we would think. So consistently we found that only a small proportion of Australians recognise that our largest neighbour, Indonesia, is a democracy. this year we added a lot of other countries to the list to see if that was an issue that was specific to Indonesia. And we found that the majority of Australians knew that India was a democracy, knew that Taiwan was a democracy, Japan was, and only 10% of Australians thought that China was a democracy. So there's a clear awareness there of the difference in political systems. And then when we were looking more at different countries' responses to coronavirus, we asked Australians whether China's response had made them feel more positive or less positive towards China's system of government. And for us, this was about the question that was being asked a lot at the beginning of this crisis, maybe less now, this idea that maybe strong authoritarian leaders are able to manage in this kind of difficult health crisis in a way that democracies cannot. And when we asked that, 68% of Australians said that they felt less positively towards China's system of government. So certainly the values and the difference in the systems of government, I think these are really important and are playing into the relationship. If Australia felt that China, this is what I think, rather than what the Australian public think, but my instinct tells me that if Australians felt that we could continue to have China as our largest trading partner without that having an impact on our democracy and our system and our society, I think maybe there wouldn't be as much of a problem. And that's one of the reasons we see until 2 years ago, Australians remaining quite positive towards China. Now, as China is an expanding power with expanding interests, these are clashing more often with more countries and causing increasing conflict in a place like Australia across the spectrum. And I think that's where people are starting to realize that actually there is an incompatibility there. We can't just have security considerations on one side, the economic relationship on the other side, kind of, exclude this and just focus on that. And that's no longer possible in this environment. And that's why Australians really are looking for diversification in the economy, as Professor Smith said, but also have these anxieties about technology and about universities and military cooperation across the board.
And I think that is a debate, where you're looking at security and economic relationship as a holistic idea, is something that is now reverberating across countries. Increasingly, you see that trend. India, for example, post Galvan has, Iveli incident, has done a lot of things in the economic sphere. You were mentioning the banning of TikTok and other apps, changing its FDI laws, trying to firewall certain sectors from Chinese presence. I think that is something that is now becoming, par for the course for almost every country. So in terms of the economic aspect in particular, do you see that debate ramping up in Australia, given China's very, very important role in the Australian economy?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine it ramping up any further. It feels like it's at fever pitch, but maybe I'm wrong. But what I would say is that despite the souring of that relationship that I outlined over the last 2 years, two-way trade has actually continued to increase. And I think that's important to recognize. There's a difference, I think, between, for example, what Professor Smith mentioned about the US-China business councils and American businesses not wanting to do business in China anymore. I think that's quite different to the Australian experience for a few reasons. The United States and China have quite competitive economies, whereas the Australian economy is quite complementary with China's. So Australian businesses haven't encountered the same level of concern that American businesses have encountered in China. We don't have as many businesses on the ground, for example, doing joint ventures, having their intellectual property stolen. It's not really the experience of the majority of Australian businesses. And so because of that complementarity, even when politically things have been very tense, we have seen this continuing increase in two-way trade. And one really important example is that China recently moved to ban 4 Australian abattoirs from exporting beef to China. This was seen as an act of retaliation and very significant use of economic coercion, but actually Australia has already reached its beef export cap for the year to China. So those exports haven't been affected by that decision this year. So there is a level of resilience in the economic relationship. And as much as publics want us to look for other markets, they also don't want us to shrink our national income or shrink our prosperity. So I think it is a longer term strategy to try to look at other options rather than forcibly decoupling from China, which is not something that I think, maybe not all, I think quite a lot of the national security community maybe think that's the right way to go, but I don't think businesses think that in Australia.
That takes me to Alex, because this question of strategic decoupling is something that America, of course, is taking very seriously, and trade and technology decoupling has reached a stage in the US where perhaps it has not reached in other countries. So when you look at Alex, when you look at the sort of Australia-US relationship, and do you see a Biden presidency, a potential Biden presidency, making a fundamental difference to the way Canberra and Washington might react to China, say from 2021, or do you see some of the fundamentals that Trump administration has laid in place, or would have laid in place by then? Would you expect them to continue with some degree of adjustment to a new administration?
It's an excellent question, Harsh, and nobody can quite answer that yet. The Biden candidacy has been pretty quiet, particularly in the last few months, for good reason. I think they've thought it best to give President Trump to manage this COVID crisis, however he's managing it. But I think what we have seen in the last year or two, particularly in the last year, is a really bipartisan consensus, I think you would call it, in the United States on China. And I don't see the United States management of the China relationship. Well, obviously, the practical aspects of the management may well change. The diplomacy will probably improve dramatically. But the essentials of the approach to China, I suspect, won't change, because the way that the security establishment talks about the relationship in the United States now suggests that there's a consensus that of a strength that there hasn't been before. So I don't think that will change. The trading relationship and the trade war that has been sort of on and off and heating up and cooling down, I suspect that may change. I would look to another push for the TPP, or what is now called the CPTPP. I'm not going to try and spell out that acronym in full. I don't think I can remember. Trans-Pacific Partnership it used to be, which of course the United States dropped out of, was one of President Trump's first moves coming into office. And I would hope that an incoming administration, if indeed there is one, would re-look at that as a very useful way of engaging in the Indo-Pacific for the United States to sort of re-engage on that. So that's not really a decoupling. If that were to be the case, that wouldn't really be a decoupling move. I wanted to quickly chime in on Natasha's points and your question about values, which I think is a really interesting one when we're looking at a post-COVID world, which is looking increasingly more hostile, particularly in the United States and China. What can other powers do? And there's more and more talk of coalitions of middle powers, particularly like-minded middle powers, working together to confront global challenges that cannot be solved unilaterally. We did ask a question in this year's poll exactly to the point that you made about clashes between economic interests and democratic values. And we've asked that question once before, actually, in the late 2000s. And 60% of Australians would say that our democratic values are more important than our economic interests. 38%, still a significant proportion, but significantly less, say our economic interests are more important. And so when we ask the question about the Quad, what Australians hear in that question, the wording actually said, are you interested in a not the exact words, but in a coalition security arrangement between Japan, the United States, India, and Australia. And as Natasha pointed out, all of those countries are recognised by Australians as democratic. And we know from the questions that we've asked in the past about what resonates with Australians in its relationship with the United States and its alliance relationship, and that is the question of shared values. This is something that I think is a strong foundation for stronger and potentially really fruitful relations between Australia and India, but also with other like-minded democracies in the region. And that's what I would hope from a post-COVID international order, which is obviously shifting dramatically. And those shifts were already underway before COVID, but COVID seems to have hastened the process, accelerated it, and what we're looking at in this next decade is something quite different. So that gives me hope that that those sort of relationships, coalition building between like-minded nations, democracies in the region is the way forward.
Thank you, Alex. And very, very, very briefly, if you can also comment on the multilateral issues and how Australians look at the multilateral order. There is a big debate around the world about the state of affairs when it comes to the multilateral order of today. And there is talk of gated multilateralization, gated globalization, fragmented fragmented multilateralism. Does it make sense to you and to Australians in general? Is there something in the polls that tells us their views on where this world order and multilateral order is? How is it evolving?
Well, talking about the world order is probably a little bit esoteric to put to an Australian in a 20-minute telephone call, but we certainly ask questions around that. And just very quickly, Australians are still very positive about globalisation, even though globalisation has become a bit of a word, and many ascribe it as the reason why the coronavirus has spiralled out of control. 70% say that globalisation is mostly good for Australia. And I'll note that Chicago Council polling in the United States finds very similar results amongst Americans. So contrary to President Trump's America First rhetoric and positioning, Americans even think that globalisation is still a good thing. Australians think that free trade agreements are a good idea. Australians are very critical about the United States pulling out of the Paris Accords, the TPP. I think they would have a similar response to its pulling funding from the World Health Organization and hobbling the World Trade Organization. And there have been some subtle shifts actually pre and post sort of COVID shutdowns. In March, we asked whether the Australian government should prioritise Australia's domestic interests over reaching a global agreement when dealing with global problems in international fora. 66% of Australians responded then in March that we should prioritise Australia's domestic interests. But interestingly, in April, when we asked a similar question about global cooperation rather than every country putting their own interests first, many more Australians and a majority said that we should have more global cooperation rather than every nation putting their own interests first. So that suggests that Australians' attitudes to multilateralism might even be firming in a post sort of coronavirus context.
Thank you, Alex. And Professor Smith, we are coming to the very end of this conversation. Can I just ask you to give us your views on what on an issue that Alex raised, this idea of middle powers, this idea of middle power coalitions, because there is a sense that leadership is missing in the world, that major powers, both Americans and the Chinese, have not been very, very effective when you look at the last 6 months of the global evolution, and a lot of the work, heavy lifting, has been done by smaller states, by middle powers, who are able to who have greater credibility perhaps at this juncture in global politics. How do you see, as a practitioner of politics, as a practitioner of foreign affairs, how do you see this trend evolving?
Well, for a country like Australia, so we're 25 million, so we're a small population, 25 million people, but we're a large economy, top 15 economies, top 15 defence and peacekeeping spender. The notion of a multipolar world, in addition to a security alliance with a great power like the United States, works very well for a country like Australia. And we have two significant problems at the moment in international affairs, which unsettles the region and unsettles the globe. It's Chinese assertiveness and what I'll quaintly describe as US policy uncertainty. And so with that environment from the two superpowers, both of whom in different ways have seen to fail in their response to COVID-19 or to not do anywhere near as well as other countries or smaller economies, then there is a natural instinct to look at the utilisation of international institutions and multilateralism, but also to regionalism or a multipolar world. And so the notion to Australians that you might be not just relying upon a US security arrangement, but having strategic and economic relations with countries as diverse but as important as Japan, Korea, India, Indonesia, United Kingdom and European Union, if I go so far west, this makes sense to the Australian population. And that's, I think, reflected in what we see in the Lowy poll. That also joins together like-minded countries, and this is the point that Natasha and Alexa both make, which is that the poll makes it clear that Australians will choose values and the rule of law over economic prosperity. And I think Australians have worked out that we had our cake and were able to eat it too for a period of time. No one expected the Chinese regime would turn into a fully fledged democracy, but everyone expected they would be what Bob Zoellick used to describe as a responsible stakeholder. But since 2013-14 with Xi Jinping, they've become assertive and aggressive and done a whole range of things where their approach is might is right. And if you're smaller than us, we'll do what we want to do anyway. Well, most countries, with the exception of India, are smaller in population and size than China. So those natural instincts to look to like-minded countries with shared values and shared virtues, whether it's Japan or India, and to look to a multipolar world buttressed by an international institution, whether it's the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization or the UN itself, with a security alliance, makes very good sense to Australians. And they've also worked out that we can't rely forever on iron ore, liquefied natural gas and coal exports to North Asia, in particular to China, that we need to diversify our economy. Natasha was quite right that perversely our export volume and size to China has grown in recent times, but that's almost exclusively off the back of Brazil not being competitive for iron ore as a result of a natural disaster and COVID-19. But China is smart enough to want to diversify its iron ore supplies by moving with Brazil to build the largest iron ore containers we've seen to make Brazil more competitive with Australia. It's also starting to explore iron ore deposits and make Africa a key iron ore export country or continent. So China can economically punish Australia to make a political point, which they have, whether it's barley, whether it's beef, or whether it's the Chinese ambassador to Australia saying we will punish you economically. But in current existential areas, iron ore and to a lesser extent LNG and coal, they have to move to diversify first, which is they're doing. And the Australian public have woken up to the fact that we need to do that as well as return to values and virtues, whether that's through international institutions or like-minded countries in our region, in particular India and Japan.
Thank you, sir. Natasha, since we are running out of time, I will let you have the last word, given you are the director of the poll. So if for an Indian audience, what are 2 or 3 things that are the key takeaways from this poll that you think need to be highlighted at this juncture?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again for this. I would just briefly say that in Australia, and maybe you could see similar trends in India, there is an increasing gap that Alex mentioned between young Australians and old Australians. And it feels like they're living on different planets. Older Australians that remember the Cold War are very much attached to our alliance with the United States and that frame of thinking. Younger Australians appear to be more pragmatic, much more passionate about climate change. And I think these divides are going to characterise a lot of our political debates going forward. The only other thing I would say is that Australians are very much interested as well in what is happening in our little region in the South Pacific, which has always been very important to Australia, but is increasingly of interest to India as well. And when we ask questions about how Australians feel about increasing Chinese presence in the South Pacific, we can see increasing concern about that, anxiety about the potential for a military base in the South Pacific. And some of these themes, I think, are going to be really important as we watch the way in which Australian foreign policy maybe even shifts from having a very global view to looking at the Indo-Pacific and the role in which Australia plays in that Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Professor Smith. Thank you, Alex. It has been wonderful to have you with us today, this evening, and some very important highlights, salient points that we came out with, that we discussed during this almost more than an hour-long session. More power to you, Natasha and Alex. I hope we keep seeing some trend lines becoming stronger and some becoming weaker over the next few years as you take your poll forward. And hopefully we can have this conversation again. And congratulations once again for the poll. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Harsh.
Thank you, Harsh.